Hello, everyone, and welcome to another Wednesday night Bible study with Rocket Baptist Church. This week we started meeting back in person, and so the recording that we have is actually going to be from that meeting. We started going a little bit further into Galatians chapter 5, verses 13 through 15. We only covered three verses, but there was pretty good conversation around those three verses. So we'll go ahead and pick up there.
All right, well, let's go ahead and get started. We are in Galatians chapter 5, and we're starting off in verse 13. As far as a recap goes, and really kind of all of Paul's letter, this really huge theme is that grace is enough. Quit getting hung up on these laws, hung up on make sure that you've checked all these boxes, and you need to realize that what your salvation is dependent upon is not by any of the works you've done, but by what the grace through what Jesus Christ has done. And with the churches there in Galatia, and of course Galatia is not a town, Galatia is a whole region, and there's several churches there, so he would have, his letter would have been sent to one, and then copied and sent to another, copied and sent to another, copied and sent to another. And that's one of the reasons why we ended up having so many copies of these manuscripts back then, because that was just how you got word across. You couldn't trust one single copy of a document to make it all the way around through this entire region and survive. And so that's why if you ever look at ancient documents, and one of the things that we look at as far as verifications and the authenticity of documents, especially like the Bible, is the question of how many copies do we have of it, how do those copies match up, and that's how old are those copies. Like, these are some of the things that Bible historians and actual literary historians look at, how they determine this. And so Galatians was a really, the area of Galatia was a really good sampling of this, and as we have this book of Galatians, the letter to the Galatians, Paul was really addressing these folks that were, well, we often call them Judaizers, the folks that were saying, yeah, you have Jesus, that's good, but you also need to become a Jew. Like, you also need to be a child of Abraham in order to be saved. You can't possibly take part in this promise that God has given to Abraham if you're not a child of Abraham. And the way you have to be a child of Abraham is, first off and primarily, circumcision. And then you start going through and you start following all the other 613 commandments. And so people were coming to Christ, and then also now these guys are saying, okay, we've come to Christ, but what else do we have to do? Well, you have to also do this. And a big part of the letter so far has been saying, look, if you start living in a way that depends on you checking all these boxes, you maintaining these 613 commandments, then you're no longer in Christ. You have now fallen out of grace. And not that God's upset with you, it's the fact that you're now trying to operate outside of grace. And guess what? We got all these thousands of years of history that say, that doesn't work. You need Jesus Christ. You need the grace. You need that sacrifice to actually atone for sins, to actually bridge that gap. And so he's carrying on with that discussion. He's carrying on talking about, he just got done with this really passionate argument about, do not fall back into this. In verse 6 was my favorite. It says, for in Christ neither circumcision nor uncircumcision has any value. The only thing that counts is faith expressing itself through love. Now that's a big deal, but it's a dangerous deal because and this is the argument that the folks that the people who were saying, no, you need to be circumcised, is because, Paul, if you don't have these restrictions, you don't have laws, then what's to keep people from just going crazy and doing whatever they want to do? And so the second part of the chapter here really kind of is Paul answering that question, and he's going into and talking about, okay, here we're no longer under the law. We are no longer under the control of the law, under the supervision of the law, but we still need to live in a certain way. And so I'm going to go ahead and read verse 13 here. He says, you, my brothers and sisters, were called to be free, but do not use your freedom to indulge the flesh. Rather, serve one another humbly in love. Okay, so again, he's carrying on that. He's reminding them, look, it's about living in a way and serving others and treating others with love. One thing I think is really specific and really poignant that he says here in this verse is, he starts off this verse, you, my brothers and sisters, or you, I think King James says you brethren, and that's the way that the Greek would have put it. So he's actually specific. He's like reminding them, I'm talking to you, fellow believers here. I'm not. This is an open letter. Historically, this is an open letter to everybody. But I'm talking to you. You were called to be free, but do not use your freedom to indulge the flesh. Rather, serve one humbly and in love. Okay, so let's kind of play devil's advocate here, because Paul is addressing lessons that were taught by folks that were arguing with him and saying that his methods and his processes are wrong. Where do you think, or what are some of the dangers here in Paul's statement?
And I think you see people still today that because we are in grace, you know, even where Paul says, should we continue in sin that grace may abound, God forbid. You know, there, I think it's Romans 6, but still some people today, they don't really look at sin in a way that's serious or biblical, I guess. And so, I mean, you see some people who they ask God for forgiveness. I mean, and we all to some degree have done this. But then you go right back out and you get right back to doing it again. You think, oh, that's okay, I can ask God for forgiveness again. And that's not really the point. And so, you know, this freedom that we have here, Paul is saying it's not, you know, we shouldn't see it as some kind of opportunity now that we can satisfy the flesh. So, I mean, I think that kind of stuff happens still today. You know, we don't understand what we really have in the freedom. So, anyways.
Yeah, I think one of the, and that's gonna come up here toward the end of the chapter is, we're kind of gonna look at, and Paul, I think Paul could have very easily, and I don't wanna get too far ahead of myself, but I think Paul could have very easily said, hey, don't just be sinful for the sake of being sinful, and left it at that. But here in a little bit, he's gonna get really specific and calling people out and saying, you know, you can't just assume that people know what's wrong is wrong. And I think this is something that we deal with today a lot, is that people want to live their own truth. They want to decide what is right and what is wrong. And I think for that reason, you know, the Lord led Paul to be pretty specific, and we're going to get into some of those specific ones coming up. But yeah, this is definitely applicable for what we're seeing nowadays.
Anytime we talk about sin, people are very quick to be able to spot your sin.
Yeah.
But they justify their own sin. You know, what I'm doing really isn't bad, but I, you know, yeah, he's talking about what you're doing, so.
Yeah.
You know, instead of what I'm doing.
Yep.
And so you have to understand that we do that. We try to make ourselves feel good. We try to indulge our own selves, our own nature, rather than serve others. And that, you know, that is a picture of what goes on in our world. In fact, I think we sometimes think we invented it.
Yeah.
But obviously Paul's writing about it back here, so.
Yeah, and I think that too, you know, that's one of the really good schemes of the devil, is convincing us that we need to be focused on us, because you know, when we are focused on us, we are quick to justify that sin in our lives, and we're quick to say, well, I'm not really hurting anybody because of this. However, we don't use that same mercy on someone else, and we see them struggling with something, and we see them, you know, we often will look at, you know, we will look at an addict or someone who's addicted to, you know, alcoholism or something like that, and we'll say, yeah, man, they really, you know, they're really messed up. To them, they're struggling with this because of something that has happened, some kind of trauma, something that has led them to thinking that this is a way to self-medicate. And so to them, that's how they're going to justify it. But we don't normally look at that immediately and go, man, that person's been hurt. They need some love. They need some encouragement. They need some extra grace in their life to be able to overcome this. And I need to do my best to pray for them and try to encourage them as much as possible. That's not the human reaction. That's a spirit-led reaction. That's definitely not what I think to do naturally on my own.
In fact, I think that this verse, Paul makes an interesting contrast, because he says, don't indulge the sinful nature, and then the contrast to that is serving other people. So what he's basically saying is, quit being selfish, because the indulging the sinful nature is always selfish, and always about me.
Yeah.
And so the way you defeat that, or the way that you change that, is by serving one another in love.
I don't think Jesus and the apostles and Paul talked about freedom in this context it was, in their minds, free, freedom to do whatever you want to do as far as sinful things. It was freedom to serve others. It was, you know what I'm saying? That was their perspective. And yet you have other people that come on and say, oh no, what you're really saying is you saying you can just do whatever you want to do. No, that's not what we're saying, you know.
Right.
But that was the twisting of, I think, the perspective.
Yeah, I think the folks that were coming in after Paul were using that as an argument to say, no, you need, he's just preaching debauchery. He's preaching all of this chaos, and Paul is trying to remind them, no, I'm not preaching that. What I am saying is that you have been free from the consequences and the condemnation of your sin, and you are no longer under that law if you are under grace, if you are being led and following, not just claiming to be led by the Spirit, but actually following the Spirit. Let's go ahead and move on. Verse 14. For the entire law is fulfilled in the keeping of this one commandment: love your neighbor as yourself. And I've always read this, and it reminds me that Paul never forgets that humans like rules. Like we want some basic instructions. I don't want to have to sit and pray about something and have to wait and listen for God, and I don't want to have to wonder, and I'm not patient. I want to be able to have a list of rules that I can say, should I take this job? I want that to be in there somewhere. Should I do this? I want this to be in here somewhere. And I love that Paul reminds them, guys, if you're still hung up on rules and you're hung up on laws and all this stuff, he says, but for the entire law is fulfilled in the keeping of this one command: love your neighbor as yourself. If we look at the example that Jesus gave, he had every ability. He had total freedom. He could have flown in or flown off that mountaintop that he's being tempted on. He could have had those nails completely disintegrate before they went through his flesh. But he didn't, and he made a decision to use those powers and use that ability that he clearly had to pardon others, to love on others and treat others well. And Paul is just trying to drive that home is it's not like you're saying, Gerald, it's not about what you can do for yourself.
Right.
You cannot, we cannot assume what we've been blessed with is just for us.
Right.
And that it is solely to benefit us, because that's not how, that's not, and I'm not saying we all need to make our own legacy or mark on history, but if you really want to make a difference and have impact, it needs to be for other people.
Right.
Because that's who's going to help live you. That's how that's how we spread the kingdom. That's how we grow our faith and grow our actual our families, is by actually reaching out to others, not just trying to hoard blessings to ourselves. And so I think but still Paul knew, no, you need something to bounce this off of. You need a rule to follow, and he reminds them this, because this isn't, Paul didn't come up with this statement. Right. This was who said this first? Jesus Christ. Yeah, there were two things. He said the entire all these laws, all 613 are boiled down to two things.
Right.
Love God and love people. And if you're doing that, and that is your actual motivation, then your individual actions are going to reflect that. And that's going to be a key difference.
And if you think about, just forget the Bible for a second, think about our government, think about laws. Any law that starts out with don't steal, don't kill, don't speed, don't whatever.
You said that pretty loud, staring at me.
Yeah, well, the don't, whatever, don't, well, I'm just trying to think of some of the don'ts. So, if you think of any of those kinds of laws.
Yeah.
If you realize, if you were more concerned about your neighbor and about the people around you than you are about yourself, you wouldn't need the law, because you'd already do it.
Yeah.
Because they're all designed for us to be able to work together. That's the reason we have laws. And that's the reason we still have to write more and more and more laws, because people don't love the neighbor as themselves. And so you have to keep telling them, you can't do this.
Yes. Yeah. And selfish people see it as an affront on their freedom
Right,
you know?
Yeah,
right.
yeah, and our argument, and this is one of the things too Facebook is a dangerous place. But someone actually referenced Paul here when they had said that you can't impinge on my freedoms, and those are the ones I really struggle with keeping quiet on. But the concept and the idea of I can do whatever I want is not the freedom that Paul was talking about, obviously, and using the Bible to justify selfish actions. The Holy Spirit never leads us into selfish actions, and that is a pretty big pet peeve of mine, and I assume that God's not a fan of that either. But that is interesting though. You're absolutely correct. We can never, and again, we're going to get into this because it's one of the things that gets mentioned as a motivation or a kind of a fruit of the flesh is hatred. You know, we can never, there will never be a law that is effective at stopping hatred. Now, we can write laws that punish people for acting upon hatred.
Yes, yes.
And that's as best we can do. No law, we can't litigate hatred no more than we can litigate ignorance. You know, we can write all the laws that we want, but those are for specific actions. The question always has to be, what is the motivating factor?
Right.
And as much as I wish we could write a law that said, you know, you have to act in love, you know, it's not, you really can't do that because it's not, we have an entire book on it already.
Right.
People aren't doing it.
And unfortunately, then you have to define love.
Yeah.
And you have to define it so that everybody accepts that's the definition, and
That'll never happen.
that'll never happen.
Then you got the issue of how's that gonna get enforced?
Right.
You know, just like any other law.
Yeah,
Right.
right.
So,
Yeah, but that's what, and I think that, you know, the way that he's, you know, that Paul says it, and the way, you know, he's pretty much quoting Jesus here, he says, for the entire law is fulfilled in keeping this one command, love your neighbor as yourself. It just goes back to that, what is the motivation behind your actions, whatever your actions are. You know, he's not, at this point, we're not even talking about specific actions, we're just talking about the things you're doing in life, what are they actually motivated by? If it is motivated by loving others as yourself, you're covered. That's what you're supposed to be doing. Verse 15, if you bite and devour each other, watch out or you'll be destroyed by each other. Okay, so I'm not sure.
So obviously Paul's not preaching to the choir here when he says, love your neighbor as yourself.
Well,
He's obviously
yeah.
getting.
So we started off the chapter by reminding that no, I'm my brothers, my brethren, my brothers and sisters. I'm talking to you believers.
And yet,
Yeah, and just 2 verses later, he's had to
keep
remind
doing what you're doing now.
yeah, if you keep this up, you're going to be destroyed.
Yeah.
And I was thinking about this, and I think about, you know, I've been involved in churches that have split.
Yeah.
And yeah, I know exactly what you're talking about, and that's all that infighting and stuff. And you know, there's a difference between, you know, because we do have a biblical process for discipline and correction in the church,
Right.
you know, and it's the approach should always be in love. The words and everything should be completely in truth, and the goal should be reconciliation. And when those aren't met, you know, when we're not seeing that carried out, and again, the motivations themselves is not out of love, then yeah, bad things happen. And unfortunately, you know, and everybody is unfortunately susceptible to it. You know, that's how churches end up splitting. That's how you end up with churches that have run off their pastors, or you know, the church now, this church just wants to follow the worship minister and not the pastor, and then, you know, all this stuff. And Paul is saying, if you bite and devour each other, watch out, or you'll be destroyed by each other. And that is a painful thought too, because you think, you know, you guys are supposed to be banding together, you know, and especially when we look at this historically, the church was under attack. It seemed, I mean, obviously more than we are in America. I mean, there are churches around the world that are still physically violently attacked. And that's the kind of stuff that was going on then. And he's saying, you need to watch out because you're going to be destroyed by each other. Let alone all these forces that are actually against you and completely away, you know, completely outside of Christ and don't know the love of Christ, that are constantly, you know, throwing stuff at you and constantly persecuting you and all this. Forget about them. You're gonna destroy yourselves from the inside. that's a pretty scary thought. He's basically explaining that if you keep going down this road, you are doomed to destruction and failure. You know, you need to realize that, you know, and again, I don't want to get too far off context here, but you know, we've been talking about in the last chapter, we were talking about, you know, pretty heavily about, you know, we're trying to rely on circumcision to make sure that you're getting into heaven, and trying to rely on all these rules, and Paul ends up, I think it's verse 11 or 12, where, you know, he makes that statement of saying, look, these folks that are all about circumcision, I wish they would just mutilate themselves. You know, and that's actually a callback to Deuteronomy, where he talks about how, you know, if anyone has been mutilated by crushing or cutting, then they can't be in the fellowship with the Lord's people. And so Paul is saying, look, I wish they would just do something to where they would have to cut themselves off and just get out of there, so where they can't be with you at all. And now, and I don't know if he's kind of reeling back in from that, just so that people understand that he's not saying that you cast out anyone who disagrees, because that's obviously not his motivation here. He's trying to encourage them to actually, you know, rely on grace and treat each other with love, or else you will collapse, or else the whole group is essentially lost.
And, you know, some of the things that we've said about the biting and devouring, and when you look at things from a experience point of view, having lived a few years, you know, and we see this even in families. We see Christian husbands and wives get divorced, and both are Christians, and I'm, you know, virtually certain both are, and yet, even if one is willing to try to do God's will, if the other isn't, you end up with a problem, with a split. The church splits, you know, you're talking about. Even if one group of people want to reconcile, want to love each other, if the other group isn't willing, you still end up with a problem. So we have a very delicate structure in a church that requires not just a few people, but it requires basically everybody to recognize this kind of a thing and work together. And yes, you can have fringe people that are gonna fight and fuss and not like this and not like that, but you certainly need the core group that recognize that I may not always get my way, but if I pay attention, if I'm loving people, yeah, I end up getting what I really wanted, even though I didn't know that's what I wanted.
And everybody just has to submit to the lordship of Christ.
That's right.
He's the leader.
Right.
And, you know, if we all are humbled before him and deal with, you know, I mean, Scripture tells us how to deal with conflict.
Right.
But unfortunately, not just in churches, but in life, a lot of people don't handle conflict the right way.
Right. And you know, historically,
Yeah.
you know, these churches that are reading this letter are gone.
Yeah, and you know, the only other thing I would say about this is, you know, I like to read Scripture literally, unless the context makes it very obvious that it's not literal. You know, they're not literally biting and devouring one another. Obviously, you know, that's a you know, metaphor, basically.
Right.
But, you know, it's still, but it's interesting because biting and devouring, I mean, that's almost like what an animal
Right.
would do. So it's a very graphic,
Picture.
butcherous, you know, kind of way of killing each other. You know, if you ever seen a lion kill an antelope, it ain't pretty.
Right.
You know, and the same thing with, this is what people do to each other. They, you know,
With their speech and
Yeah.
with their attitude.
that's right, they just tear
bind
people
it up.
apart,
So-
and it
Yeah.
must be heartbreaking to God. You know, it's just like when, you know, if you have kids and they really get tearing into each other, it hurts as a parent.
It does.
It really does, because you love them both, and, you know.
Yeah. So I guess to answer your question, Jeff, I think maybe we've gone as far as you want to go tonight.
Yeah, I think that's as far as we ought to go tonight, and we'll pick up on this next week at verse 16. which is where Paul starts to really get into that answer
Yeah.
to the folks that are saying, Paul, if we don't have any kind of rules, then everyone's gonna go crazy. And I think he kind of gives us this how, and that's one of the things, me being a very list-oriented person, I love a to-do list. I like having things where I can check off and say it's done and having some kind of sense of completion there. Whenever we get practical steps out of our instructions, it helps me a lot. and Paul starts getting into some of those practical steps. So we'll pick up on that next week. I really appreciate you guys coming out and us being able to dig into this in person.
Well, we do appreciate you joining us. Next week, we're going to be picking that up with verse 16 of chapter 5 of Galatians. I'm going to go ahead and leave you there. If you have any questions, though, please feel free to reach out. I'm going to leave my contact information here at the end of the video, as always. And as always, God bless, be safe. Look forward to seeing you next time.